Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on when you're watching this. We've gone to a lot of virtual presentations now, and I guess this will be one of them. We've had lots of disasters over the last few years, and sometimes they've been repeated, happening in the same places and the same kinds, but we've had a lot of questions about what to expect after disaster, and so we thought it'd be a good idea to talk about disaster preparation, as well as what you can expect once the flood or the storm or the fire or the drought is passed. We'll talk a little first about the flooding. I have most experience at that. I live in Vermilion Parish, and we have land that's very easily flooded in some cases, and so we'll talk about that. Certainly, there's a big difference between a saltwater flood and a freshwater flood. I think Stan will talk in a little while about what he's seen in freshwater flooding, especially the flood of '16. But I'm going to talk mostly about saltwater flooding and what to expect and how to deal with it. We're lucky that in a lot of situations, especially for hurricanes, which flooded most of our land in Vermilion Parish, we have warning, and so we can get ready. And so there's some things you can do beforehand that are critical in limiting losses and speeding recovery. Certainly we need to make plans about moving cattle. In our situation, land is going to be covered maybe for several days. And so the best thing to do is to evacuate your cattle if you can. But you have to make plans to do that. You have to have a pasture, highland pasture to go to, and then you need to be able to set up transportation for those cattle in a fairly quick time frame. Once you get that set up, when you see the storm coming, make sure you have plenty of time to get those cattle loaded and moved to your safe pasture. It is critical to get cattle permanently identified in some situations, because either you're going to get some escapes or you're going to mix cattle in some also. So think about at least ear tagging, but probably better choice would be a permanent identification of some sort, branding or tattooing or something like that, so you can identify your cattle and get your cattle back where they belong. Another situation another thing to be really concerned about is herd health. If you're going to be commingling cattle, it's critical that your cattle are protected against especially the virus, shipping fever type diseases. Make sure you're up to date with your vaccinations before storm season approaches. Also, in preparation, you should have some feed on hand, some hay on hand. Probably a week's supply would be a minimum. Again, you need some high ground to put your hay on. Have some feed resources as well, because it's going to be critical to get to keep those cattle fed during this time. They're going to be under stress, and certainly we don't want to add nutritional stress to the equation. Another issue that you need to be concerned about is fresh drinking water. When cattle are trapped in a saltwater situation, there can be serious implications. So you have to, once you get your cattle rescued or moved out of the bad situation, you need to be able to have some fresh water as soon as possible. Salt water causes problems, and the longer they stay with salt water, the more serious those problems can be. Dehydration from drinking salt water, abortions can occur from drinking salt water, and if they stay long enough, you're going to get some cattle to die because they can't drink fresh water. The other concern is once you get those cattle to a fresh water supply, they sometimes overdrink and can actually cause health issues that way as well, and even death. So make sure that you only put a certain amount of water in that freshwater trough the first time you're introducing those cattle back to fresh water. Let them drink a little bit, let them move along, and then let them drink a little bit, add some more to your trough. So do it slowly when you reintroduce them to fresh water. Another thing to be concerned about is after the flood, we've seen huge mosquito outbreaks, usually 5 to 7 days after the flooding event. We get mosquito outbreaks that actually in this past time could cause death to cattle. They were so thick. What I think happens is those mosquitoes, it's worse after a drought. If we've been in a dry situation, you're going to see worse mosquito populations. Those mosquitoes are laying eggs, but they're not hatching. And once the water hits them, they have the ability to hatch. And so we can see huge populations of mosquitoes, and they can be a serious issue. What to do about that? You know, the more valuable cattle, your bulls, things like that, could be sprayed daily. To keep the mosquitoes at least a little bit at bay. Also, we need to talk about what happens to the pasture after a flood, and we'll cover that next. When floodwaters hit pastures, the damage to that pasture really depends upon the length of the flood. Less than 7 days, some of the more aquatic species like Bermuda grass can survive. But when it gets to be more than 7 days, and some of this is temperature dependent, you're usually going to lose the entire pasture. We're fortunate in Vermilion Parish, a lot of our land is near sea level, so we often see longer than 7 day floods, and in fact, in some situations we have to pump off to get the water off. Once that water is removed, if it's been 7 days, it's going to be like you sprayed a heavy dose of Roundup. Everything's going to be brown, and most of the species, many of our pasture species, will be destroyed. So what can you do? Well, we have some species that are salt tolerant, and if it's a freshwater flood, you probably can plant ryegrass that first fall. You're not going to have any grazing. Usually it's kind of dry in the fall. So you're not going to get recovery until the following spring. We're in a pasture that was sprayed, that was flooded this past fall. It's starting to green up, but initially it was completely brown. But that's what you're going to see. You're going to see green up in the spring. The problem is to get from that flood incident to the next spring. That's going to be the critical time and the time that's most costly. Ryegrass is very tolerant of salt, and so you probably can plant ryegrass in that dead pasture. In fact, probably make a very good stand of ryegrass because there's going to be very limited competition. So think about planting ryegrass at least on some of your acres to feed your cattle through the winter. We talked about getting some hay and some feed on hand. You're going to be having to use some hay and some feed. If you can find some places that hadn't flooded and you can cut some hay, additional hay that fall, then do that as well because you're probably going to need it. We're lucky here in South Louisiana, we have a lot of Bermuda grass. It is very tolerant of salt, and so you can expect for Bermuda grass to come back, and in some cases, in a lot of cases, you're going to get a better stand of Bermuda grass than you had before because the salt species that are very susceptible to salt damage are going to die off. It includes some of our weeds and weedy species, and it's going to give the Bermuda grass a competitive advantage. And so recovery is going to come, and so you need to take that as a positive, and hopefully you'll get a lot of Bermuda grass. Another thing to be aware of is that because we have such large dead patches in the marsh and in our surrounding areas, that armyworm moths are going to be looking for something green. Often we'll get a little bit of green up right after the storm. We have plenty of moisture, especially Bermuda grass. If it's a saltwater flood, it's tolerant to salt, so it can green back up even that fall just a bit. But what we've seen the last few flood incidents is armyworm moths come in, lay their eggs, and they will actually chop the Bermuda grass down. It'll turn completely brown again, and you won't have any grazing. A lot of people will blame that on salt. It's really not salt. Look for the armyworms if you do get a green up after a flooding event. Be cautious and scout for armyworms, and maybe you can save your what is greening up with some insecticide if you can get that out there.